Hi, welcome to this demo of IBM Spectrum Fusion version 2.3. In this demo, we'll be going through the HCI install of Spectrum Fusion utilizing a private registry. I will be referencing the online documentation for deploying IBM Spectrum Fusion. The first thing you should note before you start this demo is that you've gone through the planning and prerequisite section. Please pay special attention to the power configuration section and to the network planning section. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start this demo at the installing IBM Spectrum Fusion HCI. And we'll be starting at step 1 here of the procedure. So the first thing you'll need to do is kick off the installation wizard by navigating to your host IP address :3000/ISF setup. And this will kick off the installation wizard. And as you'll see when I switch over to the demo, we'll be starting off with step number 2 here where we accept the license agreement. So go ahead and take a moment and read the license agreement page. Click I accept the license agreement. And click Continue to proceed with the installation wizard. The next step is the Getting Started page. It is broken into 2 steps. The Fusion software installation will take about 120 minutes, and it creates a 3-node OpenShift cluster. The second step builds out the cluster and installs the Spectrum Fusion software, and it'll take about 60 minutes. Go ahead and click Next. Now you'll be at the Network Pre-Check wizard. A status check is validating that each node in the appliance has an associated hostname and IP address, and this validates that DHCP and DNS have been configured correctly. If a node doesn't pass the check, it means that DNCP or DNS will have to be adjusted so that the node has a host name and IP address. And if you notice, you'll see the progress of the nodes. And what we're looking for is that all of the nodes are marked with a green connected status. And when you hit the connected status, then you can go ahead and proceed to the next step of the installer. Now, if any of the nodes do not pass the network check, they will be marked with red and in failed status. So here on our system, everything is in connected status. So we can go ahead and click Next. Okay, now that we've completed the network pre-check wizard page that went out and did an automatic network check against all the nodes in the appliance, we're going to move on to the next step, image registry wizard. IBM Spectrum Fusion HCI installs Red Hat OpenShift container platform and the IBM Spectrum Fusion software by either using the images that are hosted in the Red Hat and IBM Untitled registries. These are the public registries. Or you can use your own private image registry to install both the OpenShift and IBM Spectrum Fusion HCI software images from. But these have to be maintained in a container registry that you manage, which is going to be that private image registry. I have my images in Artifactory, so I'll select the option to install from a private registry. You then have the choice to do a single repository or multiple repositories. I'll first show you how to utilize a single repository where we have mirrored both the Red Hat and IBM Spectrum Fusion images to. And then later in this demo, I'll show you how to use multiple repositories. Next, we'll enter the URL to our repository path. And so in our case, this is going to be the URL to our offline Docker local Artifactory. And it does end with HC1230 single repo /staging. And this is the path where we have mirrored all the images to. Now the user does have to have the privileges to as many subfiles and folders as you want, but only one is mandatory. Now we are using the default port of 443. You can customize that port if you want. And next we will enter the username for that private registry. Now I'm going to enter a test username that does not have permissions to access the repository. And when I hit next, you'll see that we get an error saying registry authentication failed to log into the repository. And this is because in our case, the test user did not have the correct permissions. If you don't want to connect directly to the registry, you can utilize a proxy. And using a proxy is documented in the documentation. So now I'm going to go back and show you how to utilize private image registry with multiple repositories. The reason you might want to do this is because your team already has a process for mirroring your OpenShift images to one repository, and you'll now be hosting Spectrum Fusion images in another repository. So make sure you've checked private image registry and multiple repositories. You'll then have the ability to enter the URL, username, and password for your OpenShift image repository and for your IBM Spectrum Fusion image repository. And remember, you will have had to have mirrored over the Red Hat and the IBM Spectrum Fusion images to those registries previously. Okay, go ahead and click Next, and this is going to go ahead and verify your credentials and that it can access those repositories. This is the disaster recovery page, and Spectrum Fusion HCI can optionally be deployed in a Metro disaster recovery configuration in which two separate HCI clusters are hosted in separate data centers. And then the data is synchronized between the two clusters, and that allows the data to be recovered in the event of the loss of a data center. If we look at the documentation, there are links for more information on Metro disaster recovery, as well as the prereqs and how to set up tiebreakers. There's also information on using a standalone cluster or a disaster recovery pair. In our case, we're going to go ahead and use a standalone cluster. So we'll go ahead and select standalone cluster. You can always make this the first site in a disaster recovery pair later on. The next page is the global data platform. What you see on this global data platform page will depend upon the number of storage nodes you have. In our case, we just have 6, so we're going to see this strong data resilience option. If you had more, for instance, if you had a minimum of 11 storage nodes, you would see the better storage efficiency options. And if there were 12 or more storage nodes, then you could choose between stronger data resiliency and better efficiency building block configuration. So we'll go with the strong data resiliency for our 4+2P nodes. And if you go down and click on advanced, we'll go ahead and utilize the default because that's optimized for mixed workloads. So now click Next. Okay, next is the network customization page. So there's been some changes made on this network customization page for the 2.3 version. The network customization page shows the network configuration that gets set up for OpenShift, as well as the network configuration that's used for the internal storage network of IBM Spectrum Fusion HCI. You can customize it if you want, but you shouldn't typically have to customize these values, and you should be able to use the default values. You can see that both the OpenShift network and the storage network were pre-populated with the required configurations. Obviously, if you wanted to, you can change them, but I'm going to go ahead and leave them be and click Next. The last page is the custom certificates, and this is also a new enhancement in version 2.3. And here you can upload either custom certificates, which will be used during the install, or you can use the default certificates. Okay, and you can see here in documentation how to go about uploading a custom certificate. If you configure a custom certificate for OpenShift, you'll already have a custom certificate configured the very first time that you log into OpenShift. If you do want to skip this step, you can always use the standard OpenShift process for customizing certificates. So we're going to go ahead and use the default certificate. Click Finish. You can see we are now initializing OpenShift. This step is going to take around 2 hours. As it goes through the initialization step, you will be able to take a look at the logs. And these logs will give you information about any issues it finds and at which step in the process it is. You'll also see listed here the percentage of the installation that is complete, so that'll help you judge how far along it is. So in the documentation, we just entered next, and the OpenShift initialization page is displayed. And it talks here about what to do if there is some type of error, and if you do need to change any of the install settings. So after the OpenShift cluster gets successfully created, you will be able to view the credentials for that cluster. And it's important that time that you save these credentials before proceeding with the next phase of the install, because you won't be able to access the OpenShift cluster without these credentials. So you'll see those steps documented below. Now that our OpenShift initialization has completed, we need to go to the OpenShift credentials section and click on password and Core OS key link to download our Red Hat OpenShift. And then we need to select, I have downloaded the OpenShift password and Core OS key. I want to emphasize that it's really important that you download and save the password and key, as that's what you're going to need to log into OpenShift. Do not close the browser window without having saved these. Now, after you select this, then second step is to launch the section that gets enabled. And in order to do this, you'll need to obtain the password from the downloaded file and run the following commands, where you change directory into the downloads file, you list the files in the folder, you extract the contents of the OCP keys compressed file, and then you go to the authorization folder underneath cluster config/auth. You're then going to open the kube admin-password in the edit mode and copy the password. Now you can go to the extracted folder in the install and save the Core OS key. And then in the installation folder, the IDRS is a Core OS key that can be used to connect to the Core OS nodes. You will also want to copy the username and password from the IBM Spectrum Fusion interface and secure the username and password for future reference. Finally, you'll go ahead and click IBM Spectrum Fusion. The login page of the OpenShift container platform is going to be displayed in a new browser tab. You'll want to enter the credentials that you noted down and click Login. And the Fusion software installation stage completes and the cluster expansion stage begins. And this expansion stage is going to take about 60 minutes. So you can view the progress of that OpenShift configuration directly on your nodes. And after the status of all the node changes is configured, you'll then see the global data platform installation section is enabled to configure storage on all your nodes. And if your installation includes disaster recovery, then the connections between your disaster recovery sites are established. So finally, after all of the configurations are successful, you will click Launch Fusion to get into the IBM Spectrum Fusion user interface. And in the welcome box on the IBM Spectrum Fusion HCI user interface, you will want to click Install to install the IBM Spectrum Fusion HCI Data Protection Service. You can also click Skip for now if you want to skip that installation and do it at a later point in time. Okay, and that takes us to the end of the installation of the Spectrum Fusion HCI using the private registries. If you want to, you can go through and validate your IBM Spectrum Fusion installation. And you can also check out our other videos on setting up the data protection services that provide backup and restore capabilities directly from the Spectrum Fusion Quick Start menu. Thank you very much.